Good morning. I'm Matt Driscoll, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we're speaking with Sanjeev Kapoor. He's a senior advisor at Alton Aviation Consultancy based in New Delhi. Sanjeev, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
We had one of your colleagues on the show about a year ago, very interesting gentleman. But tell us a little bit again about Alton, the kind of consulting you do, and you guys pretty much cover the entire universe of aviation.
Right. So Alton's a boutique aviation-focused consulting firm with offices in every major continent. What makes Alton different from some other consulting firms is that it's staffed by industry professionals from different parts of the industry, whether it's maintenance, the leasing part, airline industry, MRO, etc. And therefore the consulting that Alton provides is based on real world experience, hands-on experience. And so I think there's a distinct need for that, distinct market for that. And I think Alton's done a good job in filling this niche where you need experts, global experts who've actually done the work advising clients.
As everyone knows, I had a little bit of a backup sound there. We'll start this again. As everyone knows, aviation's been decimated by COVID-19. India hasn't escaped the pain as well. The country, it's one of my favorite countries, actually. It's gone through various stages of border closures. I think you're based in New Delhi, correct?
That's right.
What's the situation like now? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in India, the vaccine situation, international traffic situation.
Right.
Are people able to fly from state to state?
hmm Yeah, so in India, the number of COVID cases, new cases per day, has come down sharply from its peak, which was around September last year. In the last week or 10 days, it's starting to tick up a little bit, but it's not hugely alarming at this point. Aviation in India, domestic aviation is back to around 80% of the former capacity and about 50% of the former traffic in terms of numbers of people traveling. There's a sense in India, rightly or wrongly, that the worst is behind us, and people are now starting to get back to work, get back to normalcy, but obviously still not at full volume. Interstate travel in India is fairly open. There are some states that have restrictions or requirements, such as you need a vaccine, not a vaccine, sorry, you need RT-PCR test, certificates, etc. The vaccination drive has kicked off a couple of weeks ago, and it's going pretty well, more than 1 million doses a day. But given India's population, it needs to get to around 10 million doses a day, but we'll get there. But overall, there's a sense in India that the worst is behind us, and we all have our fingers crossed, hoping that's true. In terms of international aviation, of course, a lot of that is dependent on other countries as well. Most major countries still have restrictions on who can enter. The two exceptions, actually now it's one exception, is the US, which is essentially allowing anyone to enter as long as you have a negative COVID test certificate. And India's negotiated these bilateral travel corridors with various countries, which says, all right, for those who are allowed to enter, subject to them meeting the entrance requirements, visa requirements, testing requirements, etc., we will permit limited scheduled flights under these air corridor, air bubble agreements. So, but international traffic is probably not even 20%, probably even 10% of what it used to be. So that's where the big gap still is. And of course, the whole world is in that situation. India is not unique in that.
And we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. I had other aviation associations that said really the overall industry is not going to come back to pre-COVID levels until 2024. I did some research, and you wrote recently that you actually expect India to be back to those levels by the end of this year. I'm curious as to why you're optimistic that that will happen, but you also said the customer mix is going to be different with less corporate travel, for example.
Right. So I think domestic India, my prediction is that it'll be back to 2019 levels by the end of this year, simply because, again, the worst seems to be behind us. The vaccination drive is really ramping up, and people are already traveling at about 50% of the volume that they used to. And in 6 months' time, I think things are expected to be a lot better. The volume will also partly come from people who used to earlier take trains and buses, will now prefer to travel by air because it's a shorter trip and considered safer from the point of view of exposure to the virus. So the mix will change. Corporates, I think, if you and I used to take four trips a month, and we come that down to 3 trips a month, that's a 25% reduction. And I expect that we will see a reduction in corporate travel, certainly 25%, 30% or so. but that'll be made up for by people who are moving from trains and buses, which is in the lower end of the value spectrum. So the mix will change. The mix will not change for the better in terms of revenue, but the volumes will be back is my prediction for domestic. For international, again, it all depends on the international digital vaccine passport and what other countries do, etc. So I expect international will take a year or two before it can get back to 2019 levels.
I have to time I have to time my questions right because I'm getting a little feedback from the speaker there.
All right.
You touched on this a little bit about the passenger experience, about PCR tests, things like that, and you just mentioned the digital health certificates or passports. I think those are very interesting. I'm a little disappointed. I'm writing in the magazine this month about. I'm a little disappointed that ICAO or someone like that hasn't come up with. I mean, they've got the standards. IATA's got the standards with its travel
Right.
pass, but you've got all these other Verifly and all these others that are handling that.
Right.
What's the passenger experience like in India right now?
Well, I took a flight yesterday. The experience has improved in certain ways because the pandemic has, for the wrong reasons, but has led to some changes in the way Indian airports and airlines operate. It's become a lot more paperless. Until the pandemic, until very recently, actually, you had to carry paper boarding passes, and security would stamp it 3 times, between the entrance and the aircraft, etc. All that has gone. In an airport like Delhi now, it's a mobile on-screen boarding pass. There's no paper stamping anymore required. Touchless check-in, etc. So a lot of touchless, paperless technologies be put into place, which I think is great. So from a traveler's point of view, when I traveled, yesterday and the day before, it's become a lot more seamless. You don't need to stop in so many places. It's self-service, it's paperless, mobile phone driven. That's great. On board, at the airport and on board, masks are required. But unfortunately, there are still a number of people who think a mask means around your chin, as a chin guard. And different airlines are, I guess, different in their level of seriousness or ability to enforce the mask mandate. The airline I flew back on yesterday was very strict about it, but the airline I flew on the way to Mumbai the day before was very casual about it. They didn't correct any passenger. But on paper, again, they're giving the rules are very strict. You require airlines are required to give masks out, face shields out, disinfectants and hand sanitizers, all at the airline's cost. So it's given to the passengers as they board the aircraft in a little plastic packet. But then thereafter, it's up to the passenger really whether they want to use it or not, and up to the airline whether they want to enforce it or not. There is no middle seat vacant mandate. Loads on some flights are very heavy, usually very directional. But I think people are just getting on with it now. And those who want to take precautions, such as myself when I travel, I make sure I don't take my mask off. I try not to eat or drink during the flight because that's an obvious loophole. And so far so good. So I think again, India is a country where people tend to take things in stride, and karma and fate and all of that. And you are in this life thanks to what you were in your previous life, and nothing you do is going to change that. And so that little bit of fatalism sometimes can work, in your favor, in that people just take things in stride and don't get paranoid about things.
I think I mentioned to you earlier that India is one of my favorite countries, and when I go there, and I tell other people this, you just have to embrace the chaos if you want to succeed there. So
Absolutely.
That's one of those things. Back to the piece that you wrote the other day, you also talked that even with everything that's going on, there's actually a little bit of a silver lining, you called it, for home market airlines. And we talked about long haul routes a little bit earlier,
Right.
international routes, but you actually said that it's going to make long haul routes more lucrative and attractive for carriers. Explain that
Right.
to us a little bit.
See, until the pandemic hit, due to a combination of reasons, one of which is Air India, became a lot less strong of a carrier than it used to be in the 60s and 70s, and the private carriers were struggling to make money and survive. Jet Airways, unfortunately, ceased operations. The India long-haul market was dominated by foreign sixth freedom carriers primarily, who have a great product, great pricing, etc., and were able to therefore attract customers away from non-stop offerings from either the Indian carriers or the carrier at the other end, the US carrier or the European carrier. right? So majority of the market was actually taken by sixth freedom carriers. And if you're heading eastwards, the Southeast Asian carriers, those big hubs are taking over the passengers. Now, with the pandemic and with people's desires to avoid a connection and to just get to your destination as soon as possible, I think people will be willing to pay the small premium that is charged normally by the non-stop carriers, and a lot of the traffic will come back, will now shift to the non-stop carriers, which are the home market carriers, essentially on either end, and they should benefit. And the sixth freedom carriers will have to obviously rethink their business model and see how they can make up for the lost traffic. But we're already seeing that. India currently has restrictions on what airlines you can travel, even within the corridors. Like if you're traveling from the US, Indian citizens can only travel the home market carriers on either end. They cannot travel on a sixth freedom carrier. It's been done to ostensibly to reduce the risk of infection by avoiding connections, but it's also served as a protection mechanism for the Indian carrier and for the carrier at the other end. And the few flights that are operating between India and the US, India and the Europe, especially the US, which is again allowing people to come in as long as you have a test report, they're doing phenomenally well. So it used to be a struggle earlier for Air India, for instance, to serve more than one or two destinations nonstop in the US, and now they're serving 4 or 5 destinations nonstop in the US. So that's the silver lining I was referring to.
Okay. And I just have to wait for the feedback to quit before I ask the next question. And it comes up right before we have to take a break. Cargo's been a bright spot overall. Has it been that way for Indian carriers? I think it has been. But like all the other carriers, you've lost some of that belly hold space on passenger flights. Touch on that for us for a little bit. And have you seen Indian carriers move to convert either planes to freighters, full freighters, or have they started using what the so-called preighters, where they take some of the passenger space and use that for cargo?
So I think you've seen a bit of all that you've mentioned. Cargo has been a very bright spot in India for the same reasons as the rest of the world, because people have embraced e-commerce as they don't want to go out and shop in person, and because medical supplies and PPE equipment needs to be transported. The fact that belly space has come down because commercial passenger flights have reduced has actually increased yields, because there's now less capacity for the demand that is there. It has made cargo-only flights very lucrative. The airlines have added, one airline in India, SpiceJet, which had entered the cargo-only freighter business pre-pandemic, has actually found itself at the right place at the right time, because their freighter business is really doing well now, even though it's a small part of the business. Other airlines, such as Indigo, did convert some of their passenger aircraft into cargo temporarily. But the belief is that, once belly capacity comes back and once the normalcy starts to return, this spike we see in cargo yields and demand, etc., will get back towards normal. So it is a temporary but very lucrative period for cargo in India as well.
Okay. Sanjeev, we need to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. And we're talking to Sanjeev Kapoor, a senior advisor at Alton Aviation Consultancy. I've got to get the consultancy in there. Your PR person is going to get mad at me. Sanjeev, you spent most of your career at Indian I keep saying characters, sorry, carriers. Right. You worked at Vistara. You played a large role at SpiceJet. I mentioned I spent a lot of time in India since the 1990s. It's one of my favorite countries. This is kind of a wide-ranging question. Let's talk about the UDAN regional scheme that has been, I think, for the last year or two, been promoted by the government. There's actually a lot going on in the country. We've got the sale of Air India, or at least parts of Air India, I guess. which I actually flew on years ago. Not the best onboard experience of my life. Low-cost carriers making big inroads there. Pick one and tell us, whether it's Udan or Air India, pick one and let's go from there.
Well, I think Uran, which is an Indian acronym which means fly or flight, has done very well because the government is subsidizing half the capacity and giving limited monopoly rights to airlines that bid for those Uran routes, which are essentially to less served destinations or unserved airports. And it has worked well. And again, the timing has been great because during the pandemic, again, people want to travel by air. So typically the Uran destinations were smaller cities where train travel dominated or bus travel dominated. And now people are traveling by air and the incentives in place for the airlines, etc., as I mentioned. So it's worked out very well. And I think full marks to the government for coming up with that scheme and for aggressively promoting it and incentivizing airlines to support it. The challenge in India, I think, in terms of growth, is actually the bottleneck is in the metro airports. Airports like Delhi and Mumbai are, before pandemic, they didn't have a single spare slot available, no parking gates, not even check-in bays. They were bursting at the seams. And eventually, even if you talk about Uran or people traveling to and from small cities, you either are traveling to the bigger cities for business, or you're connecting to the bigger cities. So until we figure out a way to expand capacity at the major hubs of India, primarily Delhi and Bombay, it's going to be a challenge to maintain the growth momentum, regardless of what you're doing for the small cities, because again, you need to get to the big cities. One statistic that I like to mention, which is startling, is that since independence, which is 1947, India added just one runway to its top 5 cities, net addition of one runway. And China in this period has added, you can't even count them, 30, 40, 50 runways, right? Leave alone airports. Now, if you've added just one runway to your top 5 cities in 75 years, that tells you just how much of an infrastructure challenge we have. Now, things are starting to change. We've built new airports, new terminals, but for whatever reason, whenever India builds a new airport, they start with one runway and one terminal, and it's always thereafter, we're in a catch-up mode. New Delhi was an exception in that it already had 2 runways, and then when they expanded the airport and built a new terminal, which is a wonderful new terminal, they added a 3rd runway, and now they're in the process of creating a 4th runway. So the only incremental runway that was added was a 3rd runway that Delhi added in the last 75 years. Mumbai or Bombay has been talking about a new airport for the last 25 or 30 years, but I don't think ground has been broken yet in Navi Mumbai, which is the location of the new airport. So Mumbai actually used to be India's busiest airport or air city until about 10 years ago, but now simply because they have no capacity, they have a single runway airport. The growth has just been now throttled, and the growth has occurred in Delhi, which added a new runway. So the correlation between airport capacity, runway capacity, and economic growth and passenger and cargo traffic growth is very obvious and very direct. And until we as a country start addressing the airport infrastructure, runway capacity issues, I think we're going to remain challenged in terms of catching up with the Chinas of the world. Even when you do have airports with capacity theoretically, the smaller airports, Chandigarh, Amritsar, etc., they may be single runway airports, but they have capacity, but they don't have Cat 3B, they don't have ILS, you can't operate at night. Sometimes they're military shared airports, so they set restrictions. Goa, for instance, Srinagar, on which hours civilian aircraft can operate. So all kinds of constraints there. So the constraints are not just in the metros, which are the biggest constraint, but we need to step back, I think, and just relook the entire approach we have. It's not just build new airports. It is optimize and expand the capacity and maximize the utilization you can get out of the existing airports. And I think that thinking has to come into place as well. So to me, I think that's the biggest challenge we have in India is infrastructure in terms of what's going to impact growth. The other major challenge, of course, is cost. India is one of the lowest yield markets in the world. It's still a developing economy. Per capita income is quite low, etc. But the taxation rate, the aviation fuel cost, etc., is amongst the highest in the world. And I think there's been a lot of discussions over the years with the government. The government is aware of this. They have other constraints, of course. They need to, collect taxes and, invest in other schemes as well. But it's not easy to be in the highest fuel cost, highest taxation regime when you have the lowest yields in the world. And it's actually a miracle that any airline can make money in India. And there have been airlines which are well run which do make money, but they tend to make money only when fuel prices are low. And the minute fuel prices get beyond, say, $65 a barrel, uh, it's hard for any airline to make money in India because of everything else that they have to deal with. So those are the two constraints: infrastructure and taxation and cost of fuel, and the taxation on fuel. And I think when those get addressed, you'll see Indian aviation really take off to a different level.
Sanjeev, let me ask very quickly. I mean, let's come back and tell me what you think about Air India, but that also leads me to my next question. I know MRO is not your area of expertise, but that seems like another area where taxation, the heavy hand of government, is a big problem
Right.
with spare parts and things like that. And again, it's the heavy hand of government, which we'll blame on the British for all the what they left in terms of Indian government. Does the government need to get further out of the industry, including MRO and all of that? But let's start very quickly with Air Asia, Air India, and what you think about
Right.
that, and then let's talk about the government a little bit.
Right. Now, Air India is a fantastic asset in terms of its brand name, the bilateral rights it has access to, the slots it has in airports like Heathrow and Hong Kong, etc., which is not constrained. Also, the network, domestic and international, is a strong network. Those are the positives of Air India. The negatives, of course, is that very high cost structure, inefficient, customer experience has been spotty. Old contracts, maybe not the best contracts in the world, old equipment, the product is not up to the mark in many cases, etc. So I think if someone with deep enough pockets can acquire Air India and can manage to renegotiate a lot of the historical liabilities and debts and invest in upgrading the infrastructure, and at the same time can have the kind of leadership to change the culture of the airline, which has now become, a legacy airline culture, to become more customer focused, and can bring in a professional management team with no political, sort of pressures. The Air India can become a huge success story once again. I mean, Air India until the 70s was run by J.R.D. Tata, the founder of Air India. Even though it was nationalized in the 50s, he was still the chairman and still essentially ran the airline. And it was one of the world's leading airlines at that time, and now it has obviously fallen on very hard times. But again, with the right investor, the right owner, the right management team, and the right inspiration, I think it can do wonders. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of money, not just to acquire the airline. That may be the cheapest part. Is how much do you have to pay to acquire the airline, but how much do you need to thereafter invest to fix the airline? It's not going to be cheap at all.
And let's talk about the heavy hand of government. Should the government take they came out with the budget recently, and there were a few things that were handed out for the aviation industry, and I think some of that touched on the MRO sector, for example. But just in general with aviation, I mean, should the government take a more hands-off approach and let the industry take the lead?
Right. So let's talk about the period pre-pandemic, because during the pandemic, I think many governments all over the world have gotten fairly heavy-handed, and for obvious reasons. But if you talk about pre-pandemic, my personal view is the government was not really heavy-handed. I actually had a fairly positive experience working with the aviation ministers and aviation ministry. I found them very progressive. I found them very appreciative of the challenges. I also found them very keen to work together with the airlines to try to figure out, what needs to be fixed or what needs to be changed. The challenge is that they're just one ministry, and there are multiple ministries involved. There's finance, there's petroleum, there's industry, there's all kinds of, highways, infrastructure, etc. And aviation is just one of the ministries. So the challenge is getting all the ministries to align together, and that takes time. India, as you say, is fairly chaotic, fairly messy, and has a lot of other priorities, other than aviation for these other ministries to be looking at. Therefore, things take time. But I think there's a general realization of the government that we need to fix what's broken. but we just need to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight, but at least there's a realization and there's the intent.
Okay. You recently talked again about a new approach to network planning, new routes, how I'll move away. We touched on this earlier, away from the hub and spoke to point. But you specifically mentioned eco-friendly aircraft types, and I'm curious because with CORSIA and all the other things that are going on, and I'm reminded of a press conference that Alexander Juniak had in South Korea at the IATA AGM back a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and he was asked by Reuters if one of the Reuters correspondents really got under his skin and said, is aviation a polluter? And he said, hey, come on, we're responsible for X amount, 2% of emissions around the world. Is sustainability in aviation a hot topic in India? Go ahead.
Well, there's increasing awareness about it. It's not as hot a topic as it is in the West. I think only one airline in India has a carbon offset program in the booking flow, for example, on the website. But it's something that needs to become a hot topic because the environmental issues in India are severe. At a place in New Delhi, the pollution indexes are off the charts, right? So I think every industry, every citizen has to try to do what they can to minimize their contribution to this and to reduce their contribution to these pollution levels. Now, aviation is not something that you can do away with. You can't just say that, because it's polluting, shut it down. But we can, as an industry, try to take whatever measures we can to reduce the amount we pollute. Getting the newest generation aircraft, which tend to have 20 or 30% fewer emissions, is a step in the right direction, of course. Another aspect that I think is something that I've been very, very vocal on, but it's going to take decades to catch on in India, is, and I'm in the minority on this, and I don't make many friends when I say this, but I think India needs to start looking at the European model of partnership with trains for shorter haul connections. I mean, there's no reason for the last mile of the journey, 150 kilometers away, to fly on a connecting flight if you could get onto a train at the airport and get there in 60 minutes or 90 minutes, right? And trains are electric and less polluting. So I think, and that will also help by reducing the pressure on slots at the airport, so you don't have your slots taken up by these little puddle hoppers or turboprop aircraft, right? So I think a complete new mindset towards how you plan your networks, who you partner with for short haul, thinking of trains, airports being built for train stations as a part of the plan, etc., long haul or at least intercity train stations for short haul. All of that needs to be looked at, and I don't think it is being looked at in India in terms of airport design or integrated planning. And if you could do what sometimes you can do in the US, in Germany, with Lufthansa, have a single boarding pass that can, with a Lufthansa flight number that takes you from your plane to your train, and your luggage gets transferred automatically. That's the way of the future. That's what we need here.
Well, obviously it's like everything in life, the proper mix of what's required. The plane when you need it, but a train when you can.
Yes.
And all of that. So, to me, that makes what you're saying just makes sense. We talked about this earlier, and I'm conscious of our time. We need to wrap things up here in a minute. But earlier we talked about paperwork. India loves paperwork. I remember most of my flight back in the 90s flying in. It was a nightmare with the paperwork and everything. And this was before everybody had an iPhone and all of that. I flew in with a laptop, and the guy wanted to make a special note in my passport about the laptop, and I said, come on, you're crazy. He said, oh, you might sell it. And I said, no, I said, it's my job. I mean, why would I sell it? Anyway, but and you talked about this earlier. You said now when you go to the airport, everything's done on a mobile phone, digitalization, automation, self-service. Mm-hmm. So we see that happening. And again, we talked about the travel pass. But my question is, with all these different applications, and let's take the travel pass, for example, mm-hmm. IATA's got one, the Commons Project has one, IBM has one. I think I counted there's at least 7 or 8, maybe 10 out there now. Are we just, my problem is, which one do I use, and are we just trading a paper form for a digital form? Am I going to have 10 different apps on my phone to get through the airport?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we need to have a common standard. I think IATA needs to drive that standard. I think they're working towards that as well. And then we need to trust that standard. The standard obviously needs to allow instant validation and verification of your vaccination data, or visa status, whatever it is. And then the bureaucracies need to start trusting these electronic platforms and stop requiring you to print out what you've entered or re-enter on paper. And that still happens. India, for whatever reason, for good reasons, has always loved paper, rubber stamps, and signing. Again, I'm hoping that the pandemic has opened their eyes to the fact you don't really need that, and it's often justified in terms of its security and national security, etc. But then my argument always is that the rest of the world can do it. Why can't we? Why can't we get away from paper and rubber stamping and this and that? So I think mindset is starting to change. The biggest gap still remains for international travel, where you still need to stand in line and show your paper passport and get it stamped. And when you arrive in India, you still need to fill up forms, etc. There's still no kiosk passport, digital channels, etc. India needs to start, thinking of that very seriously. And again, the reason why it's not being done is not because the technology doesn't exist. It does all over the world. It's because there's a feeling that you can't trust the machines. You need a human being to verify that the person coming in is not going to do harm to the country. So that mindset has to change. But I'm hopeful that that change will come. And again, if you talk to people, in the industry, in the government, I think they get it. It's just that how do you change the culture and mindset of the hundreds of thousands of people who need to support you in what you're doing, and that's going to take time.
Okay. And it reminds me, did you ever see the movie Minority Report? Do you think we'll ever get to that where you get your iris scanned and you get served ads and you get clearance and all that?
Well, I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen aspects of that. If you land in the UK, for example, and you have a digital or e-enabled passport, you don't need to see anybody. It's an iris scan. The downside of of all of this is that how many people know everything about you, right? And where are they storing this data? And now every move that you make is being tracked, and every place you go is being tracked. So there's that downside. And can it be limited or localized so that you pass through the airport and they scan, they know it's you, but they don't store that data and pass it on to someone else, right? So it's the privacy concerns, I think, is what might be holding it back. But I think technology is the way to go, and we just need to have the safeguards in place and just roll with it.
Well, I actually think the governments know all about us now just from carrying the smartphone around, and
right.
It gets pinged everywhere and all of that. So I think we're past that point. And
yeah, that's true.
The good thing is I'm an innocent these days. I don't get into near as much trouble as I used to when I was in my 20s. So that's
right.
A good thing.
Your wife knows where you've been or where you're going. Right?
Absolutely. Sanjeev, I always like to end these interviews on a note, and our time is up. Are there any bright spots out there that we can look forward to? Anything particular to India?
I think if you look at India, the aviation industry, we are still at the bottom of the upslope of the hockey stick. There's huge potential. Per capita number of trips is still, very, very low. And therefore, if you make the right investments in infrastructure, bring the cost structure down, etc., I think the potential for aviation in India is phenomenal. For aviation travel in general is phenomenal.
Okay. Sanjeev Kapoor, Senior Advisor, Alton Aviation Consultancy. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you so much. Pleasure being here.